central question that often arises concerns the process and means of effecting change in people as well as the circumstances in order that these needs are met, human potentials realized. One common but very specific means of seeking change is psychotherapy, which ordinarily focuses on the individual. Psychotherapy is a planned purposive Will it read it for me? Let's find out.
Psychotherapy is a planned, purposive,
and confiding interaction between the trained, socially sanctioned healer and the identified sufferer. The focus may be broadened to include groups and family members, but the raison d'etre, the emphasis in psychotherapy is that someone has been a problem to himself and or to others. There is now a growing realization, though not fully accepted upon, that the identified patient is part of a larger problem, conventionally narrowed to nuclear family dynamics, and that this person is as much a problem to others as others are to him. We leave aside the debate on whether one form of psychotherapy is better than another, or if a given approach changes subjective states, symptoms, behaviors, or total personality. Generally speaking, such debates are important, and the huge resources devoted to psychotherapy outcomes studies necessary. In reality, however, these debates are similarities and differences between approaches loses their salience when one is considering the oppressed who in any case have thus far less profited from the debate, research, and clinical practice. It should, of course, be noted that even those who focus on revealing subjective symptoms alone often argue that the change in this domain will have behavioral and social consequences. Another common approach to change is that which aims to directly transform social institutions and systems by organizing and mobilizing people. This approach may or may not have explicit goals of changing persons, but it usually is guided more or less by an articulated worldview, a conception of what calls for change, and goals are realized through social intervention. It so happens that both approaches, namely psychotherapy and social change, have different relevance and urgency to people, not simply because of personality differences, but more importantly, because of where a group is situated in the prevailing social order. The fact that the establishment psychologists focus only on the first, that is, changing symptoms, behaviors, and personalities, but not institutions and social structures, shows in part their own class position and allegiance. However, those psychologists who work with the oppressed find that they must work to change pathogenic social conditions as well as persons. And here is the rub. For indeed, psychotherapy aims towards changing stabilization of a identified victim. There are immediate and personal difficulties to be resolved, pain and torment to be relieved, and a personal interest of the patient to be given priority. Frequency and duration of contact are, however, limited, usually to about an hour a week, and often more than a dozen sessions. Now, assuming that a member of the oppressed seeks psychotherapy and it is provided, that appointments are kept, and that therapy proceeds as planned, what realistic changes can be accepted? Is it not a worthy accomplishment if at least the anguish of symptoms and the self-defeating pattern of behavior have been changed through psychotherapy? At the same time, however, was a concession made to the prevailing social order by effecting adjustments to it. Is it reasonable to state that psychotherapy may be appropriate and necessary for this patient, but essentially conservative with respect to the status quo of oppression? This is psychotherapy, therefore, basically an instrument of social control, not social change. If so, are there ways to helping this victim with his immediate, specific, and pressing problems, but not by compromising the goals of the collective? These critical questions become salient in the working with the oppressed. It is, of course, unconscionable to deny anyone the right of therapy in order to ensure the realization of a revolution in this uncertain future. Yet questions of changing causes and not only symptoms, of preventing and not only treating casualties, of empowering victims to solve their problems and not keeping them dependent and powerless, of fostering a collective action and not a self-defeating privatization of difficulties. These issues must be squarely confronted in situations of oppression. Of course, one can learn many things from establishment psychology and working with individual casualties. Casualties. These include, to cite only a few, understanding the power of dynamics and the unconscious, and appreciation of childhood experience with attending formative scripts for the self and relations with others, manipulating environmental conditions to change behavior, and acquiring skills from hermetic. I'm gonna look it up. Hermetic. I don't even know what that's. Let me look it up. Thank you, Rachel. Hermen. Oh my God, it's not gonna say it for me. Come on. Here we go. Hermeneutics, which means the theory and methodology of text interpretation. Hermeneutics, as well as methodological rigor. But the crucial frontiers that remain unexplored, including how victims of oppression can be empowered to act in a coordinated way to change themselves, their social conditions, and historical predicaments. Herein lies one of Fanon's pioneering contributions. Intervention in conditions of oppression typically run into two major pitfalls that reoccur with remarkable frequency, and hence requires careful consideration. One common pitfall is that those who undertake psychotherapy among the oppressed focus on the immediate and private distress of individuals who lose sight of their shared victimization and the necessity for social transformation. They fail to act upon the pathogenic social reality, and in the end merely sanction it. Their intervention, if sought by the oppressed and when successful, is therefore doomed to an essentially quote bandage operation. On a few casualties who nonetheless return to the same unaltered conditions of oppression. Sooner or later, it is realized that the labor of the psychotherapist with the oppressed is akin to labor and siphons. For some, the resulting pessimism becomes an excuse to join those who long ago threw their lot in the more lucrative pastures of private practice. Working with those who can afford more lucrative pastures. Working with those who can afford it. A few persist, undaunted, as some must, with their bandaging operations, selling for less, both in impact and remuneration. Remuneration, yeah. Another equally common pitfall is that those who work towards social and community transformation forget that it is above all people who are the subject of history. Either they conceive a change abstractly, fixated on grand structures lacking human content, or they seek to make visible impact on material objects, using real and living persons as fodder for their own grand ambitions. In consequence, even the very people in whose name everything is ostensibly justified are compromised, betrayed, and sacrificed. Such reformers fail to recognize the hypocrisy of talking about remote goals of social justice while abusing and stunting real and living persons around them. In reality, both pitfalls reflect a failure to adopt a dialectical perspective. In this first, one focuses only on identifying victims and their immediate problems without engaging in their concrete and living social historical context. This amounts to an attempt to rehabilitate biographies without any grounding in history. That's why historical materialism is important. The result is usually either a minimalist view of change or worse, a conservative outlook that blames the victim. In the second, an account of the larger context and remote goals is taken while the reformer is disengaged from the subsequently disengages. Yeah, the very person on whose behalf the change is ostensibly sought and justified. This amounts to a way of making history without actualized biographies, save that of self-styled activists and leaders. The result is at best an imposition of change from the top and paternalistic attitude towards the oppressed and the viled tyranny in practice. Okay, some critiques the psychotherapy are admittedly so sweeping and categorical that they amount to a therapeutic nihilism. One must appreciate that therapy, the traditional and even interminable type, does provide a service to certain categories of people. The search for an unitary, fixed, and universal relevant mode of psychotherapy is indeed futile. It is more prudent, as Strupp pointed out, to ask, quote, which constellation of patients' characteristics and problems are most amiable to which techniques conducted by which type of therapist in what type of setting. In implementing such a therapeutic program is certainly easier said than done, but Strupp's remarks underscores that no mode of technique of intervention, however sophisticated in theory or buttressed by professional respectability, can have equal relevance to different people in different social predicaments, as practiced by different therapists. Freud himself warned against viewing psychoanalysis as a panacea, even for the type of patients for whom and from whose experiences his therapeutic modality was developed. Indeed, this modest goal of helping these patients learn substitutions of, quote, ordinary human unhappiness for neurotic mysteries, end quote, is contrary to present-day claims of psychotherapeutic omnipotence. There is a common tendency to claim that a given modality or technique that has shown efficacy tendencies to claim that a given modality or area that for some persons and or for some problems has equal relevance for all persons and for all problems. There is also the opposing tendency according to which a given modality or technique is considered absolutely relevant for all if it does not meet the needs of the group to which one feels committed. The first tendency illustrates therapeutic imperialism. And the second, therapeutic nihilism. Each social group, if determined to forget or reclaim its authentic biographies and history, must define its own problems, seek its own solutions, and choose its own means. It can, of course, learn from the experiences, insights, and errors of others, but it cannot appropriate, lock, stock, and barrel problems for solutions of others in order to forge authentic biographies in history. This is so in therapy as in other areas of life. What works for white, middle-class neurotic cannot equally meet the needs of the properties of the poor, the priorities of the poor, the powerless, and or the culturally different. To assume that it can or must, an assumption made all too frequently. It is not only the misappropriated and misapplied, but also to commit the ethnocentrism and solipsism discussed earlier. The well-documented rejection and failure of prevailing psychotherapy practice with the majority of the oppressed have many causes. I will mention only a few to underscore the need for alternatives. As indicated earlier, not only a few clinical services offer the oppressed, despite alarming reports of need, but also that little is offered is generally low in quality. Numerous studies show patients from low socioeconomic groups are not readily accepted for psychotherapy, that they are more usually institutionalized and over-medicated, that they have high dropout rates in outpatient treatments, but are institutionalized longer as inpatients, and that they are more often assigned inexperienced therapists. That's the whole commodification of many barriers to therapeutic efficacy with people of color. The racial and class impediments to therapeutic alliance loom large. Griffin, 1977, has shown the multiple problems plaguing the encounter of white therapists and black patients. These include problems that both the therapists and patients bring to the encounter by virtue of their class and color. The therapist may assume that all black people are inextricably locked into a psychology of oppression, hence taking for granted an immutable mark of oppression, quote unquote, or he may succumb to his own anxieties and guilt and thus avoid any mention of racism, thereby giving, quote, the illusion of colorblindness, end quote. Another set of problems pose a threat to therapeutic alliance in the encounter of a black therapist and a black patient. Significantly, these problems center on the question of identity. The black therapist may have his own unresolved conflicts about being black, and therefore may adopt a counterproductive, quote, denial of identification, end quote. Or he may take a posture of over-involvement, blunting therapeutic objectivity and engagement by succumbing to, quote, over-identification. Even if the therapist experienced no problems with his blackness, his class position and values are potential source for mutual distrust and misunderstanding. Also to be noted is that the prevailing psychotherapy is often constrained by the time-worn dichotomy of subject and object and the underlying epistemological reductionism that has long characterized Western thought. One set of treatment modalities give primacy to cognitive and subjective states, harken back to the idealist outlook, whereas the other assumes the supremacy of internal, external, and environmental forces, consistent with empiricism. The first emphasizes insights into the reliving of experience, thereby giving priority to internal changes and to the subject. The second, which favors the object, focuses on behavioral contingencies and their manipulation in the belief that changes in external objects will necessarily engender eternal change. Most treatment modalities derive from one or the other reductionist approach, with a few attempts an integration of the two essential approaches. Yet, the dichotomy between subject and object, the separation of change within from change without, and the fact that both approaches spring from Eurocentric and classic specific value posed fundamental barriers to the development of the liberative psychology. The dichotomy of subject/object invades, or at best only partially addresses, the simultaneous task of the oppressed to transform themselves in their social conditions. What is more, psychotherapists of both orientation have been known to fall far short of their competencies when, quote, treating black patients. Those who favor internal change often succumb to a rehearsed stereotype that black people and the poor are pervious to insight. Those who focus on external domains usually limit themselves to modifying only the behavior of a person, but undertaking no program to change his pathogenic social conditions. The first implicitly arrives at a verdict that little or nothing can be done to change the patient's predicament. The second installs a more vigorous social control and hence sanctions of status quo of oppression. The lesson of the, quote, community mental health movement, end quote, in the United States also shows that vested professional interests, the politics of funding, and hardened biases outweighed fleeting concerns about social justice and the plight of the oppressed. The history and consequences of the community mental health movement cannot be summarized in a few words. One must nonetheless mention that the social unrest of the 60s brought the allocation of resources to forgotten populations, the ability to fund impressive structures, and exciting possibilities came to lure many professionals who otherwise would hardly have ventured into the underdeveloped places and I have to do this for the ghettoized racial feelings. I had to do that in order to understand. Professional attitudes began to change traditional tenets where re-examined and some innovative practices were introduced. But the clamor for community and prevention became wimpier and was also muted as federal funding dried up and the conservative mode took over the nation. Mental health professionals once again flocked away from the poor and the slums to wherever funds could be had. Private practice, the defense establishment, the sundry other lucrative ventures. To this political and economic reality, research and practice were adeptly adjusted. Notions of community and prevention, more speculatively talked about than seriously acted upon, lost their appeal and urgency. And the more the poor and the oppressed were quitted and pacified, the more they were once again cast into a familiar oblivion. One lesson from this brief moment of reform and its essentially failure is that the oppressed cannot rely on others for solutions. Another is that no amount of external funds, no measure of professional men culpa, and no flood of promises by well-meaning reformers can substitute for self-empowerment and social activism by the oppressed. Great disappointments await the oppressed who leave their destiny or the fulfillment of their frustrated needs to professionals and bureaucratic elites whose actual allegiances is to the status quo. The latent and pseudoscientific justification of oppression aside, this elite remembers the oppressed only when, quote, the natives, end quote, are restive and violence is in the air. When smoldering rage and fire can no longer be contained within the bodies and neighborhoods of the oppressed, it is then that they risk, like firemen, to put out or contain that threatens the prevailing structures of privilege and dominance. But once the oppressed are pacified with violence, the threat of violence, drugs, or some reforms, this elite, with the exception of a few whose concern with social justice is genuine, rushes back to its accustomed comforts and amnesia. What is needed in situations of oppression is a mode of intervention that bridges the separation of insight and action, eternal and external, individual and collective. So those are dialectics in my opinion. The oppressed are economically and socially too pressed to wait indefinitely for an insight apart from lived realities. For how could some engage in endless monologues while swamped by demands on one's time, space, energy, mobility, and bonding? Can one arrive at internal harmony while faced with threats of evictions, the tyranny of an employer or unemployment, life on borrowed time, restricted movements, and relations rendered objectively conflictual? By what justification can reality be kept in abeyance while there are so few options but to either supply, drown, or barely keep afloat in turbulent social currents with a minimum of self-determination? Would it not be possible to gain insight while acting on real problems, treating not only through words but in deeds, emphasizing not how one is alike but like others, and helping forge new bonds nurtured in the collective struggle? Indeed, the very structures and medium of therapeutic intervention itself requires critical reevaluation and supersessions. For how can an intervention liberate the patient from social oppression when the therapist/patient relations itself is suffused with the iniquities, non-reciprocity, elitism, and sadomasochism of the oppressive social structure? Can there be realistic grounds for changing self-defeating behaviors and a negative self-concept on the context in which only the doctor initiates and the patient accommodates, where one is powerful and the other is powerless, where one exudes omnipotence and the other is locked into impotence, where one remains confident and well known in the comfort of his office and values, while the other reaches out alone and helpless to an alien context of a friendship for sale? They're saying basically that we're buying friends. But by what conjuring tricks could one affect fundamental changes in the personality relationship with others? A social condition of the oppressed, when presumably the healing, quote unquote, relations itself is a microcosm of the status quo of oppression. It is therefore surprising that the oppressed have not come in droves to seek help from mental health professionals, and if a few of them turn to therapy, quote unquote, as a last resort, that they soon drop out and return to their old trivials. Psychologists have studied the myriad aspects of wildness. Remarkably, however, the obvious and immediate have been neglected, in the obscure and remote. The relationships of wildness to oppression, the denial and or abdication of liberty, which is essential characteristics of both, the uncritical enactment, in quote, therapy, of the iniquities of and power relations prevalent in society. These fundamental aspects have been neglected for elusive cause and cures, for whatever contributions may derive from an accumulating biomedical and traditional psychological research. And there are undoubtedly many. The problem of wildness and oppression will nonetheless continue to elude us so long as the questions of iniquity, power, and liberty are evaded. One can easily show that society tends to react more reflexively when it is a question of those who somehow come to be identified as, quote, abnormal. The group often reacts with an anxiety of epidemic proportion and or organic sense of treat. It matters little if the punitive patient is actually harmless to himself or to others. The diagnosis that he is a wild person, therefore wild and dangerous, is irrevocably taken for granted. Hence, the group undertakes swift and violent measures to protect itself from the peril it conjures up, creates, or exaggerates. The community feels safe once it kills the identity deviant, performs on his brutal psychosurgery, keeps him in chains, locks him up, or forces his compliance with potent medication. It is remarkable how often the mysteries of wildness, including its cure, are sought in the attributes and constitution of the identified patients without considering seriously the psychosocial dialectic of those who feel the compulsion to classify, ghettoize, and persecute some of its members. Of course, scientific advances have been made over the years, and ostensibly brutal measures of controlling have been humanized. Yet, as often happens, the more things change, the more they remain the same. If wildness, they use the M word, reflects something about the putative patient and the social milieu to which he or she belongs, racism is, psychologically speaking, a projection of a, quote, blackness within. On the safe subject, Mononi, who analyzed the psyche of the colonizer, pointed out that in the final analysis, the black person is the white man's fear of himself. The more white people externalize their unacceptable blackness within to safe objects whose skin color is black, the more they find comfort in who they are. The more black people are kept in underdeveloped communities, the more unacceptable impulses are, I have to do ghettoized, sorry. I don't know how another word for it, but yeah. The more whites scapegoats black people, conjuring up the shared threat, the more they find groups for an otherwise unlikely alliance. Winthrop D. Jordan, 1970, made an observation that through slavery, Americans, quote, may in fact have found enhanced fluidity of the American social structure above the racial lines, end quote. And that, quote, the firmness of black people, exclusion may have served as a bedrock, permitting the revolutionary social mobility among whites without the crippling apprehensiveness that proper social order was entirely by the board. It is ironic that the nation that came into existence with the solemn assertion that, quote, all men are equal, was at the same time dependent on the enslavement of black people, and that Jefferson, who drafted its Constitution, was himself a slave owner. One wonders what the character and destiny of the United States would have been without slavery, without the projective screen black people continue to provide. The point here is less about speculation of what may have been than what in reality happened to be. Black people not only serve the economic needs of whites, they also have been made a unifying scapegoat, an anchor of shared identity, and a human receptacle into which are dumped unseemly and misanthropic proclivities. Without the presence of an exploited and scapegoated masses of black people, North America may have turned out to be the continent of warring nations, a new battleground for descendants of those who could not live together in Europe, dragging countless others into at least 2 world wars. In a sense, beyond the obvious causative role of objective oppression, the multiple deaths and alienation rampant among black people in the United States served as a psychosocial, and, oh my gosh, prophylactic. I'm going to look up that word, everybody. Oh, yeah. We gotta free the freaking mental health place. Please. Prophylactic function for whites, and let me see what it means. Hold on. I forgot to look at what it means. Prophylactic is a medication. Oh, it's a medication measured for device designed to prevent disease, infection. Okay, good. Functions for whites. If nothing else, the belief that there exists black people who live under worse conditions than one's group, that they represent what one never wishes to be, or that they even exemplify the dangerous, quote, wild man, end quote, against whom the group shall band together. Such beliefs do serve psychology and socially integrative functions for whites. The question is, however, will black people continue in this double jeopardy to objective oppression and psychological cannibalism? And what can psychologists do to help change their predicament? Much has no doubt changed in the attitudes of whites and behaviors of black people during the past decades in the United States. Yet there still remains vestige of old stereotypes and exclusionary practices. One also continues to find some black people who willy-nilly live out such imposed images as that of the wild man, Caliban, Sambo, or Uncle you-know-what. Indeed, in other conditions of oppression, black people in America are to this day caught in a narrow and perilous balancing between the social synoptic affirmation and the self and of the self and an ego synoptic conforming to the prevailing social norms of society. Since their being is often apprehended through the haze of racial stereotypes, their socio-synonic, syntonic behaviors are probably by ego diagnostics, whereas actions that to them are ego syntonic may be to others social diagnostic. Sorry, everybody. Thus, the elaborated stereotype and institutional practice entail a vicious cycle. To embody these stereotypes and adhere to the norms is to validate the status quo of oppression, and hence to subvert the interests of the self and group. To reject and resist them is to invite confrontation with forces seeking to enforce and perpetuate the status quo. Thus, a black person who openly resists living out the images of SAMBO and Uncle you-know-what risk a diagnosis of antisocial personality or even paranoid schizophrenia. The person who meekly submits to these stereotypes and control risk not only self-estrangement and betrayal of group interests, but also the psychoaffective rupture both entails. In this sense, the difference between the criminal justice system and the mental health industry is one of form. Whereas from the perspective of the oppressed, the difference between crime and insanity, I have to say that, is partly one of degree and personal complicity. The oppressed, who is a criminal, quote unquote, is revolting alone without consciousness and even conscious, whereas the oppressed, who is wild, they used in you-know-what, is capitulated to such a crushing degree as to the battleground of seething seeing contradictions. Given this higher potential of being either a criminal or insane, the oppressed cannot attain liberty by individual means and without consciousness. To revolt against or even to capitulate to the status quo of oppression without risking criminality or insanity, I have to say it, one must therefore be anchored in a collective that helps bridge the psychosyntonic, and ego syntonic, and no programs of amelioration, no plan of rehabilitation, no intervention with the best of intentions can have lasting and redemptive consequences without empowerment of the collective and active engagement of victims. Powerlessness and demoralization characterizes the oppressed, whether they are locked in mental institutions, penned in slums, or kept in check by internalized but ego-diagnostic social norms. No, they got blocked. In therapy, as in all interventions with the oppressed, the paramount significance of collective goals in social practice needs to be recognized. As Vasquez, 1977, amply demonstrated, the ruling group in society and the ruling ideas they espouse have historically stigmatized praxis and those on whom they focus, the chores of cheap labor and servitude, leaving to slaves and workers the job of tilling the land, of fighting wars and erecting buildings, and to toiling the factories when they kept for themselves the luxury and prestige of contemplation and intellectual endeavors. Thus, except for activities related to political governance, scholarly endeavors, or artistic work, most other forms of praxis and those social group laboring for others have remained stigmatized. Psychology, too, intended to favor conditions and effect over praxis, when in reality only purposive organized the social and socialized activities is the foundation of psychological transformation, for validation of knowledge, and for the elaboration of civilization. Undoubtedly, the transition from the old introspectionism to behaviorism marked as watersheds in history of psychology. The redefinition of psychology as the scientific study of behavior led to many advances in theory, research, and practice. The pitfalls of introspectionism and the problems derived from purely subjective claims are too well known. At the same time, however, the tendency to emphasize discrete behaviors, stripping of relational and interventional content, rather than organizing a willed human activity, as its own pitfalls. Not only does such an approach serve to decontextualize human activity, it also leads to a neglect of human agency, as well as the consciousness it entails. Praxis requires a measure of antecedent, one leading the other. Consciousness and motivation, which in turn transforms as a result of praxis. Therefore, a break from the ahistorical, contextualized, and desocialized considerations of behavior. A return to an emphasis on practice that reconnects people through organized action towards common goals, restoring their lost attributes as subjects and helping them regain rights they have been denied is very much needed. The transition to what I would call psychopraxis should be not only in theory, but also an intervention, intellectualization of experiences in therapy sessions, and shedding tears in privacy in the consulting room may indeed result to some insight and some relief from the immediate pain. But the goal of changing persons and circumstances require more, above all, socialized praxis. Changing should be sought not only in the person, but also in the social milieu. As Fanon clearly indicated, to lock up a person in a cell left to his fantasies and hurt is simply to sanction and intensify the very pathology to be cured. It is also to reenact, in the name of science and care, the very sadomasochism, rejection, and violence prevalent in his social life. Moreover, it is not enough to search for a quote-unquote cure by conjuring imaginary roles and concocting artificial groups, when real aspects of a person and his social milieu can be engaged, confronted, and changed in the real society. The oppressed, rather incarcerated in institutions or made captives by prevailing social normalcy, can rehabilitate themselves and change their predicament only in so much as they rehabilitate and desalinated their practice. Their space, time, energy, mobility, bonding, and identity cannot be restored by inaction. Physical, social, and psychological death is too heavy a price for an accustomed passivity, a corrosive apathy, self-defeating individualism, and predictability of stagnation. Psychological work with the oppressed must give priority to organizing and collective activity to regain power and liberty. One critical focus of intervention has to do with unraveling through active and involvement and demonstrations in the social world and self-defeating patterns of relating and tendencies towards betrayal of the self and or others, the internalized script for failure and disaster, as well as the conditioned fear of taking a stand or even fear of freedom, all of which derive from a contrived system of socialization and elaborate formulas to produce willing victims. Another crucial focus is the comprehension and refinement of strategies as well as tactics for regaining power and liberty. Saul Alinsky, 1972, made the point that, quote, men speak of moral principles but act on power principles. We may add that in acting on power principles, there are those who have power and those who do not, the oppressors and the oppressed. With the moral principles often justify this state of affairs. Psychological work with the oppressed was not about de-alienation of practice, and regaining of power tends to produce morally entrapped and compromised objects, not liberated and creative subjects. It is by acting towards, with, and or against others that our wishes become revealed, our knowledge develops, our personalities is objectified, and the change of people as well as of the circumstances is affected. It is also by reasserting the individuals into groups through actions with and on behalf of the collective that even a paranoid, once privatized and pathological, could find collectively shared and hence non-pathological appropriations. One cannot but marvel at the many belief systems that, if declared only by one individual, qualified or wildness, but when espoused by the collective to extol as religion or justify on grounds of national security. Power and liberty are, of course, never given they are demanded, taken, and assumed. Excuse me. For if and when given, they are at best conditional, often superficial, and readily taken away. The struggle for power and liberty, the forging of authentic biographies and history, at once entailed a struggle against a force posed to maintain the status quo, and a struggle to eject internalized control and images. In most situations of oppression, this dual struggle cannot realize its goal within the narrow confines of prevailing legality and proselytized religious precepts, forced institutional regulation, and ordinary social etiquette. Which of these aspects constitutes genuine human values worth retaining, and which constitutes only mechanisms of domination always need critical evaluation. There comes a time when a demand of the oppressed for the same rights enjoyed by others is quickly condemned as an illegal act, a sacrilege, a defiance, or simply rude behavior. Like what we said, like when black people like talk passionately, we go, "Why are you being so aggressive? Why are you so mad?" That's like rude behavior. We're saying they're making rude behavior when they just want to be heard, and they're passionate because they live the situation. It's for us to shut up and listen in that case, and to like validate that and humanize that as people that are listening to that. More oppressed can advance only if conscious and convinced of higher laws and morality than those which ensnares them in servitude. Organized, conscious, and collective action is an antidote to alienation in its various forms. So it requires us to go ahead and bring up. I'm gonna bring them up. I get it. And we're gonna give to, yeah. Organized consciousness and collective action is an antidote to alienation in its various forms. It canalized psychic energies for constructive ends, binds members who otherwise turn against each other, and remains the most reliable means of self-determination. In Dying Colonialism, please people read that book, it's a good one. Based on his observation during the Algerian struggle for liberty, Fanon demonstrated how a radicalized and activated community determined to take control of its destiny frees up its hidden reservoir of energy and creativity. Biographies become enriched as the group sets out to make its own history. People who for a long time suffered abuses in silence and privatized their troubles took up the cause of liberty with remarkable courage and a sense of belonging. Dead and ritualized elements of the indigenous culture regain new life and dynamism as history was being reclaimed, as fixed traditions were regaining dynamism. So too were the individual biographies being restored to their natural course of becoming. The relations between, that's the new species that Fanon talks about, the new person, the new community, the new people. They're turning all that stuff that they personalize and they turn towards, and they're pushing it outwards. They're doing healing by resisting. The relationship between people, between men and women, husband and wife, parent and child, leader and led, also underwent drastic changes. The imperative of the nation and the forging collective destiny superseded the rigid roles of family life, paternal authority, traditional roles, and old conventions, including sexual behavior. Significantly, as Fanon affirms, once a dominated group takes control of its history, it assimilates at a remarkable speed, but in its own terms. Alien ideas and technology that previously were rejected outright or accepted with organic ambivalence. This is because under the conditions of oppression, when reciprocity and equality are negated, one tends to resist the influences of the other. Kind of like when in that Dying Colonialism, they talked about the radio, and like people that are Algerian, they didn't want to get the radio because they didn't want to more assimilate it. They thought it was just a tool of the white man that, to keep us culturally French. So, but they had to change because when they started resisting, the FLN was broadcasting on the radio. And what they would do is they would tell all the people that the FLN is failing and they're losing. When in reality, FLN were doing great. So they utilized the radio in order to have that news, to be able to be inspired and to continue the revolutionary progress, So yeah, that's what, If and when some influences are assimilated, what is assimilated is often distorted and self-defeating. This fact is amply demonstrated by the adoption of the Western medicine under conditions of oppression. In short, the psychology of oppression is a topic of pivotal significance to which Fanon made seminal and pioneer contributions. At the kernel of this psychology are the facts of pervasive violence, a Manichaean view of the world, black and white, and ambiguity of the self, and various forms of death. In fact, recorded history is the history of the victor. Established psychology is also an elaborated system of rationalizations for the status quo and a refined instrument of social control. We have seen how much violence is unleashed in the name of scholarships, science and healing. Psychology of liberation would give primacy to the empowerment of the oppressed through organized and socialized activity, with the aim of restoring individual biographies and a collective history derailed, stunted, and or made appendage to those of others. Life indeed takes on morbid qualities, and sanity becomes tenuous, so long as one's space, time, and energy, mobility, bonding, and identity are usurped by dint of violence. To transform a situation of oppression requires at once the relentless confrontation of oppressors without, who are often pervious to appeals to reason or compassion, and an equally determined confrontation of the oppressor within. Those violence can unleash a vicious cycle of autodestruction to the self as well as to the group. For without this dual confrontation, the search for personal harmony remains elusive. Wildness becomes rampant, even though sanctioned normalcy. Interpersonal violence persists, even among loved ones, and death in its various forms remain pervasive. Apart from the conscious and determined struggles, there is no quick fix, no mental exorcism, no struggle for private salvation, and that can herald a restoration or usurped biographies and histories. The struggle for justice through violence must of course be a last resort, not only because such means enact untold miseries for all involved, particularly the oppressed, but also because they leave behind a legacy of wrecked psyches and an anti-democratic tendencies. Yet consideration of these dangers should not justify inaction or amply that lost rights can be reclaimed without the persistent demand. So like usually a revolution or a violent act towards a state is one that is a counter, is a defensive measure, because the state is acting on us. We are defending ourselves through resistance. Well, yeah. The organized activity and the organized institutions of the oppressor must be countered with the reorganized activity and the reorganized institutions of the oppressed. Goals must be defined, programs to fill them developed, and the oppressed shaken to organize action within a structure or human values imbued with the clarity of what truly is pro-social from the antisocial, and of what constitutes human needs apart from superficial needs. The true meaning of violence, crime, accountability, and liberty are deliberately so confounded by the oppressor that the oppressed are readily ensnared in the web of confusion and internalized prohibition that are as defeating as the array of external controls. We have seen how, in consequence, the oppressed are made captives in a vicious cycle of social, psychological, and physical death. Those are the three deaths: social, physical, and psychological. Psychologists who take seriously their concerns for the oppressed must foster, teach, and perfect what Penderhughes 1972 called confrontation tactics, and Pierce 1970 offensive mechanisms. Fanon 1968 was making essentially the same point, but in its extremes, because the particular oppressive conditions of which he wrote and sought to transform was brutally violent and proved impervious to all but counter violence. The particular confrontation tactics or offensive mechanisms taken, of course, depend on the type of oppressor one faces, the resource at hand, and the timing that is most opportune. But whether by peaceful or violent means, it is only through organized struggles that the oppressed can change themselves and their predicament. Few put this as aptly as Frederick Douglass did Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progression. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did. It never will. Find out just what people will submit to, and you will have found out the exact amount of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted with their words or blows, or with both. The limits of tyrants are proscribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. And that's it. That is the end of the book. So now we have a little bit of time to go over what we read. Let's make sure, making sure. Hold on. Making sure. Yeah. Hold on. Select the biographies. Nope. Yep, we are done. All right. So what we can do is what we can do is anybody who wants to come up and talk about what we just read and about the book, you're welcome up. No one. Interesting. Okay. So my whole take on this is what I get from Fanon is that psychiatrists in the psychiatric field, the mental health field, needs to do two things. They need to help the person within and help his social structure, help his elements, and they also need to help people to understand how can they face the system of oppression and how they can exert their energy towards liberation. I think that's what's missing, because he did say it. He said that because, like, yes, there are good therapists out there, sure, but they're hard to find. But most of them are utilized for the rich, for commodification, and for social control, to find out who is a deviant to the main dominant group. Can't hear you. Heard you a small bit. Come on.